Let me just introduce Mary Good. Okay. Properly, she served as professor and dean for the College of Engineering and Information Technology at the University of Arkansas. I couldn't have picked another university. At Little Rock, currently she is the past president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, past president of the American Chemical Society, and is a member of the National Academy of Engineering. And knowing the government, she has served a four terms as Undersecretary of Technology in the Department of Commerce, and of course, that's where the National Institute of Science and Technology is. So that's Mary Good. And our other person is Robert Berga. He has served as an Executive Director of ASTRA, the Alliance for Science and Technology Research in America. ASTRA is a collaboration of more than 127 companies, academic institutions, professional and trade associations focused on increasing federal research support for physical sciences, mathematics, and engineering. They're going to attempt a synopsis of what occurred during the last 8 hours. so
Mary's going to try.
Except what I just say as an introduction.
Okay, thank you very much. It is late in the evening, and we'll see how well this goes. The main thing is to get some response back from the audience that's still here today as to what you thought about the program today. But I did want to start by congratulating the organizers of this conference, because it is true, although I disagree pretty much with Mr. Gold's last talk, which I'll talk a little bit about. We are in the process, if you looked at the funding and so forth, we are in an era in which we do need to have a better understanding of why R&D and the STEM disciplines are so very important to the industry today, to the country today, not just to the industry, but to the country as a whole. And so this workshop and our measurements are not as good as they ought to be yet, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But to put this on, I thought was really timely, and I really congratulate all of you for putting it together, and I thought dividing it up in the way that you did between funding and the workforce and the assessment piece, and then, of course, the policy piece, because all of these are part of what we're talking about. The funding is going to depend, frankly, on our workforce arguments and on our assessment ability as we go down the pike. So, and also what the policy people will be willing to accept as legitimate arguments for what it is that most of us in this room would like to see. So again, my congratulations for people for putting this on. So far as I know, it's the first time that we've actually had one put together like this for strictly looking at measures of innovation and competitiveness that I think is going to stand us in good stead. What I'd like to do is to just make a few comments, and these few isolated comments that came to me during the discussion today, and then to have a few things that I've noted down that I think we ought to focus on for the future. First of all, with respect to engineering, the discussions today with respect to engineering, some of those were really sort of depressing in a way, because if you look at manufacturing, we have everybody now wanting to revise manufacturing and to revitalize the manufacturing sector. One of the most important workforce issues in manufacturing is engineering, and engineers trained that can do modern manufacturing and can manage modern manufacturing. And if you looked at the numbers that we've seen today, the R&D numbers in engineering are going down more rapidly than almost any of the other disciplines. And secondly, the number of kids that we're trying to get into the engineering field is not going up very fast. So this, to me, seems to stand out of all of the one just isolated piece that I thought stood out today that we need to take notice of. The other was the ability to recruit students, and part of the discussion, in my opinion, is as important with respect to that as it is to justifying what we're doing to the policymakers and to the Congress. If you look at the numbers, we've put a lot of money over the last 15 to 20 years in the public domain about how to induce students into STEM fields, in particular engineering and the science and technology and mathematics. And if I look at the numbers, they've changed very little. We really haven't made much impact, and we've put quite a lot of money into that. Now, currently, there's a lot of money going into it, mostly funded by the industry. Big industry like ExxonMobil has major programs. They're putting over $100 million in it. Intel is putting another $100 million in it. And if we don't figure out how those dollars get spent, and most of that's being spent by educational institutions, and if we don't figure out how to be sure that those dollars get spent in such a way that it increases the interest, that's not going to continue because they'll figure out that this is not going anywhere and they'll not put another $100 million into it. So I think this whole issue of how effective we are with respect to getting the interest of the young people to come into this field, I think is really very important. I was extremely pleased to have the representatives from the Red Bank School that were here today because, in my opinion, that's where it's at. If you can start getting kids involved at that stage, and if you continue. Now, the problem is we do a lot of that, and then we don't do anything for them until they graduate. And the other issue is that the universities then, in many cases, particularly in the hard sciences and in engineering, spend the first 2 years of a kid's career doing nothing but mathematics and physics with no understanding of why that's necessary. So there are some issues here if we're going to make a change, and one of them is in this business that we've got to move that needle with the number of children who are interested in science and engineering over time. I think the argument from my point of view is that STEM education is for everybody. If you look at where we're going and the complexity of the world today and the fact that it is technology driven, whether we like it or not, it seems to me that STEM education has to become a necessity for everybody. Almost everybody in this room would argue that humanities are still a necessity for education. None of us argue against that, but you'd be amazed at the number of universities who are now in the process of even removing the requirement of college algebra from the curriculum for anybody except a science and engineering major. My view is that that's in the wrong direction. Mathematics is the language of the 21st century, whether we like it or we don't. And so we've got to change how you do mathematics so that kids are not so frightened off by it. So I think that the whole issue of STEM education, it's not just for STEM professionals, it really has to be for everybody. There was a PBS special the other night on the retraining where we are revitalizing manufacturing, and they're retraining some people who got laid off from some of the old manufacturing, particularly in the Midwest. And one of the things that they had some of the students that they put back in the junior college to figure out how to get them to the point where they could actually be productive in this new production. And of course, they were talking about the fact they were made to take trigonometry and algebra, and they'd been scared to death of it when they were kids. But they figured out that, by golly, if that's what it was going to require to get back to a job that they didn't have, they'd go try. And they managed to make it. But that's what the basic principles were that these people were being taught, that and computers. Was being taught to be able to manage these new manufacturing facilities. So instead of backing off from teaching these things, I think we've simply got to stay the course, and they've got to be part of the curriculum in general. With that, let me talk a little bit about, so those are just some of the pieces that sort of flared up as we went through today's discussion. Looking at the future, it seems to me that one of the most important things we've got to be able to do is to convince the policymakers, the Congress, and the public of what is reality today. Ron Hero's talk would scare us all to death, but he's correct and it's true, and that's what it's all about. And somehow we have to get people to understand that that is the environment in which we're going to have to try to compete. And we need to get those messages to people in such a way that they can understand them. Because we are going to have to work pretty hard if we're going to maintain any kind of a standard of living. Because if you look at everything that's happened during this recession, everything that has been, almost something like 50% of the people who lost jobs ended up getting new jobs. Most of those new jobs were at least 30 to 40% less pay than the ones they had that they lost in the first place. That is what that does, is simply reduce the standard of living. And if we don't think about that and have people understand that we can't just continue to do what we're doing, and we can't believe that we're on the top of the world and need to do nothing, because we still have a fair number of people who believe that as well. So I think that our institutions of higher education are also involved in that. And I'm very concerned about that. We built up a system of higher education in the United States which is the envy of the world, and still is, actually. Although that's weird, we don't any longer, if you look at the top 10 universities in the world today, we don't own them all anymore. But we do own 5 or 6. So the issue here is that how do you maintain a really high-quality system of higher education? And if you look at what is happening in the states and those that have in the past been state-supported, this is going to be very difficult to do, because many of those universities are really getting raked over the coals. They're losing lots of dollars, and you can't continue to lose $40, $50, $100 million out of your budgets and continue to do what you've done in the past. So partially what they're doing to make it up is to raise the tuition. So that means it's going to be more difficult for our kids to get into those universities, and particularly because those were the places where everybody had a chance to go and had a chance at a really quality education. So I think that's something that we need to try to impress on people, that we need to figure out a way to support those institutions. And if they're totally dependent upon what the income that they get out of tuition, you pay for it one way or another. What that means is that the number of kids who will end up with good educations will just go down. The other issue is that the education and higher education and all of these activities to get us to a competitive position, they've got to be done all across the country. The country cannot survive on Silicon Valley and the 128 in Boston. It's got to be, the country as a whole has to improve. And if we don't, for example, if the Midwest does not recover somewhat, you're going to end up with states in the United States that are third world countries within the country. And some of them are close to that today. And if we don't worry about that and be sure that this distribution gets to the point where these sorts of activities are available to the future generations wherever they happen to be. And I was really pleased on that Red Bank one today, because I know where that is. I lived in New Jersey for 5 years, not very far from there, and I know exactly what they're tackling. But what that says is it's possible to do it, and it's possible to run high-class and high-quality education programs anywhere in the country, and that's what we've got to try to do. The globalization issue is here. It's not going to go away. It's a major issue and will continue to be. You know, we're going to have to share with the rest of the world is about what it amounts to. We've got some people who believe that, and we heard some of that today, that we only pay for R&D in the United States and therefore it's used by other folks, so why do we do that? Well, there's a very good reason to do that. We do still use a lot of it ourselves, but more importantly, we've also got to learn how to train our R&D work, our STEM workforce in particular, how to mine information that is generated outside the United States. If 2/3 of the research are being done elsewhere, we better figure out how to capitalize on some of that, the same as everybody else has learned how to capitalize on what we do. And we actually do inhibit that today. If you look at your federal research grants that universities get, and you look at the issues that you get back about ITAR and all of that, and you can't carry your message anywhere else in the world, and we also now have limits on travel, and we can't get our people out to the places where the best conferences are going on. And this conference is put on by IEEE, and the majority of the major important IEEE conferences this year are not in the United States. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we need to be able to get our people to those so they understand what everybody else is doing and can put together the technology that's happening elsewhere, put it together with their own, and therefore come up with better ideas about how to proceed. So we've got to get over this business that we can't leak, because first of all, we're not going to be able to stop the leaks. That's not going to happen. You better start gathering as well as worrying about the leaks and add to what we have. The other issue that I'd like to just say a lesson or two, one comment or two about, is that we made the decision back, the Vannevar Bush thing was discussed today, and essentially the United States made a decision at that time, and it's still in place, that we would educate our STEM professionals by adding research to the university's activities. Before the Second World War, research in the universities was not very high. It was minimal, it was scattered, it wasn't very, it was not as good as was done in private institutions. But the country made the decision that it would give research dollars to the universities, and with that they were charged with the responsibility of creating and educating the next generation of STEM, or if you like, the workforce, and particularly the graduate education was given over totally to be funded by essentially research dollars that came to the universities. So these things are tied together. You can't, if you can't remove the R&D dollars, if you still expect to get those same trained R&D professionals coming out of the universities. So we've got to be able to put some of these things together in ways that make sense and that people can understand. And I'd only say a word about measurement. The measurement discussion today was really interesting, and it's true, we haven't been able to do as well as we should have. However, the measurements are better than I think some people believe. The National Science Foundation did a really good measurement, what I thought, or justification measurement, assessment, however you want to call it, was done about 20, 25 years ago, and it was called TRACES. And it's interesting, they never repeated it, and I never understood why. And when I was chairman of the board, I tried to get them to do it again, and it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of time. But TRACES put together the case studies of some of the most important technologies that had broad implications, and they traced them all the way back to the basic science that was done to start. And I remember one of them that was really stark was an NMR, which, as you all know, is now one of the major tools in a lot of things, not just in medicine, but it's used to measure and to image a lot of other things as well. And it started with the very first experiments in quantum mechanics by the physics faculty, trying to measure spins, nuclear spin, which was what they were trying to figure out, what it was, what it meant. And if you understand NMR, that's what it's all about, is how to manage nuclear spins and how to measure them. And it traced that all the way through from that beginning, all the way through to the kinds of things that then had to take place, where the engineers created computers that could manage that thing. Designed better instruments, could measure that. And so there are some good cases where you can make the argument that it goes all the way back to the basic science. It may not look like it now, because you'd have to go back and do the traces properly to understand the interactions. And one last comment, and that is that we also need to make the argument. Every talk today had to do about the practical applications of science and technology and engineering. We really ought to remember what science and technology brings to the public understanding of life itself. There has never, ever been a civilization that did not try to do astronomy. Astronomy, for the most part, doesn't pay off anywhere, doesn't build anything. We build a lot of things for it, but it doesn't create many industries. In fact, it's one of the last activities that creates one-off kinds of manufacturing, where you build one mirror to make one kind of measurement. But where would we be today if we didn't understand the universe that the astronomers have been able to bring? So I think we need to put a little bit of humanity back into this discussion, as well as just what the practical applications are. Because who wants to live in a society that knows nothing about the natural environment? So when we start these measurements, I think the measurements have to include what it is that we provide for the public good and the public understanding of who we are and what we're all about. So with that, I'm going to open the floor and ask Bob if he'd like to add any comments. And then I'd like to open the floor and let's have a little bit of discussion on some of those issues if we could, okay? Okay, we got 5 minutes left? Okay.
Let's go to the floor, please.
Okay. But that's my take of today's meeting. And I do congratulate the organizers, because I think it was enormously timely, and I hope some of these things get followed up on.
This is time for those folks who don't have questions but have declarative statements.
That is true. You can make
well,
comments. They do not have to be questions. They can be comments.
Well, maybe this is a little bit of a combination. Philip Lapel from MIT. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the metric part behind this and relate a little bit to some of Dan Sarowitz's stuff. Because, I mean, there's this very important question about what we measure from several perspectives, one of which is, be careful what you measure because you will get it.
Yeah.
When you ask smart people who, with money on the table, to do certain things, they will find a way to get it, to do that. So you really need to be sure that you're measuring things that indicate something that you want to get out. But the other is, sort of how we know something about the value of the metrics. I mean, there's certainly a big disconnect between, Dan, I mean, I don't want to trash this paper that he referenced because I haven't read it, but there's this terribly difficult to understand statement that says, in very few instances did the innovations along the paths that are the source of commercial success benefit in major ways from R&D or protection of intellectual property. And one of the cases they gave was MRI. And even before what you just said, I said, anybody who can't trace the R&D history of MRI is not the right person to be doing a case study with.
I agree. They've never read the history of it.
Because it's all over it, both in the magnetic resonance imaging itself, or the magnetic resonance itself, before and after imaging, and in the assorted technology, the magnets and all that stuff.
That's correct.
And a related piece of that, I mean, Dan started out with this sort of joke graph about the relationship between the number of pages in the Ipcc report and the carbon output. So, what's the correlation between that? Well, hold it. Now think about this for a while. We all hope that there is a correlation between that if we write enough and talk enough that it will bring the carbon output down. But you have to have a time lag in there, And you probably have to look at the change in carbon output, and maybe per capita, not just gross carbon, but you certainly have to put in a time lag. And this time lag question is, I think, very important as we think about metrics. When do we want to look at the innovation, and when do the quote research, and when are we going to see some innovation out? And I think it's also important in education, because I hear you about we need to get more people interested in STEM and all that, but I also know people who recently graduated from good schools with engineering degrees, especially in, say, civil and environmental engineering, who aren't finding jobs. Mm-hmm. Now, they've got the time lag problem that they got to figure out 4 years before they start, you know, what's going to be a decent field, and they got to figure in how long they're willing to wait, because I hope that those really are good fields for their careers, but they're pretty tough right now.
Yeah, they are.
So what do we do for our students in terms of that?
You know, that's an extraordinary question, because all of us who understand and work with students on a daily basis understand how desperate that is. The problem you have is that the discipline can change in importance in terms of a job particular by the time the student starts as a freshman and by the time he graduates. So, you know, my advice to students normally is do what pleases you and what you want to do and what you think you'll be happy doing. And then try to, once you get out the other end, don't fence yourself in. Look for things that are close to what it was so you can use the education that you got. It may not be exactly in the field that you thought you would be in, but there are lots of other areas where you can use that education and use that knowledge and still like what you do. So there's just no way. You take a student who for example, particular people who do PhDs. The time it takes to get all the way through a PhD today, I dare you to decide today what particular area you would advise a student to do when he's going to graduate with a PhD 10 years from now. I mean, you know, I don't think anybody in this audience would be willing to guess what that might be. And you're absolutely correct. The educational piece of that is really tough to deal with. But the other thing is, though, and I don't think we don't teach students well enough to be flexible. We don't teach students that for the most part, what we're teaching them is very amenable to other kinds of things. And if they can't get the job that they thought, or in their minds they saw when they started, they think they're a failure. And they're not necessarily. You know, some of the best science journalists around have been trained in hard science. So they need to be flexible and be willing to look at regulatory jobs, of which they're now going begging. In other words, particularly those who did environmental science, you know, they can now take about a certificate program in regulatory science, and all of a sudden everything they've learned is good, and there are jobs for them, both in the industry and in the government. So it's just a question of having kids to understand that they've got to be flexible, and they've got to learn to use the knowledge they have in areas that they might not have thought of before, and the educational system's got to help them do that.
I'd like to add just 2 cents, if I could, as well. Yes, I know we're very short on time, but during the sessions today, particularly Ann's presentation and Diana's, suggested, when we got to those later graphs, that we do lack an operative theory. Is it economics? Is it an innovation theory? So if you'd say we're measuring lots of things, but it goes back to Lord Kelvin. I think he had some sort of theory as to what he wanted to measure and why. But I'm not sure that we do. And therefore, that confuses the policy and the informatics that we strive to do. You know, more is good, but all we want is more. Well, that's inadequate. It's not sufficient. So just a quick 2 cents. But that's something we could work on.
But I would just make one last comment. If R&D and the STEM disciplines and the STEM workforce is not so important, why is the entire rest of the world trying to catch up with us? Measurements or not. Thank you very much.
Let's give a big hand to Mary Good and Bob and Berga.